button is. Good morning. On behalf of the Missouri Council for History Education, I would like to thank you for coming and being with us today, talking with Dr. Berkin down here. She's saying that the one thing that she finds when history teachers get together is that they like to talk history and they like to be able to share information and ideas with each other. And that's exactly what we try to do with our conference every year. And we're so glad to be pairing this year with the Illinois Council, and their president will be addressing you in just a few minutes. Can I get my board members to stand up, if you would please, from the Missouri Council? All right. These are the people you need to complain to if you have any problems. Thank you very much. Tim O'Neill down here is our webmaster, and if you are a presenter and you have materials that you would be willing to share, please get in touch with Tim. You can email them to our our email, or get in touch with Tim, and we would love to download things so that other teachers can get them. I know I usually find that there are 2 or 3 different sessions I want to go to when I can't get materials from all of them. And so it's nice for us to be able to have that. So we're glad to be back here at the Fed. We want to thank them for hosting us. Thank the History Channel for sponsoring our breakfast. We would definitely want to thank the Missouri Humanities Council. We're going to be doing a number of programs with them in the next few years, particularly as we get into the bicentennial, and sponsoring our Visiting Scholars program. Flannery, can you stand up again back there? If you are interested in having an expert on any area of history, come to your school and work with your teachers. Talk to Flannery. We're planning our next grant application, and we'd love to put in for some more money. Steve likes to hand it out, and we like to spend it. So it works quite well. Thank you. So talk to Flannery. We've got some really good people that we can line up in order to do things. We're looking for locations for next year for our conference. We'll be outstate somewhere. But we're looking at a number of possibilities. So please check our website. We've been updating it. And if you should have a flyer that you picked up this morning that has our website on it, our email on it, information. You are all now members of the National Council as well as the State Council. So pass the flyer on to someone else that you'd like to have join us. We love to have you here. So at this point, Dean, I'll turn it over to you and make some comments from Illinois, and then we'll pass it on to Joan.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dean Pinos. I'm the state liaison for the Illinois Council for History Education, and I'm also serving on the board of the National Council. And on behalf of the National Council, I want to welcome everybody to the conference. And how about one more thank you to Joan and her wonderful team for this conference. This really is a beautiful venue, and I think we've got a great lineup for you today and tomorrow. And it's wonderful to be at a conference where teachers are being treated as professionals. That's a remarkable thing. So I'm pleased to see that. I also want to thank all of you for your membership, either in the Missouri Council or in the Illinois Council, and for your membership at the national level. You are all members of the National Council for History Education. And I wanted to speak just briefly on what NCHE is, what its mission has been, where it came from. In 1987, the Bradley Commission for the study of history in schools was created. And it was created because there was a concern about the quantity of history being taught and the quality of history being taught in American public schools. And in 1987, 15% of American students could graduate from an American high school never having taken a course in American history. 50% of American students did not take any courses in world history or Western Civ. And the Bradley Commission was charged with investigating why that was and hopefully with providing some recommendations on how to remedy that. The last time that a systematic study of history in public education had been done was in 1892 with the Committee of 10. So it had been quite a while, and it was a worthwhile endeavor to look at that. And the chair of the Bradley Commission was the eminent historian Kenneth Jackson from Columbia University. And what was unique about that group was that it was made up of 16 people. And it wasn't made up purely of academics from the university level. It also was by design meant to involve teachers from the classroom. And this was really where NCHE's sort of mission came from, that teachers were not simply to be told what to do, but to be active participants in figuring out what is important for students to know. And in that sense, the Bradley Commission was very unique and very important. And in 1987, when the commission was founded, one of the things that the group argued for was the creation of an organization that would advocate on behalf of history education and specifically work with K through 16 educators to try to create a history curriculum that was inclusive and that was in many ways much more democratic. And so NCHE was born out of that. In 1990, NCHE was created, and we just celebrated our 25th anniversary a few years ago back in St. Augustine, Florida at our conference. So we're thrilled to have you as members. We would love to see you in San Antonio. Our San Antonio conference, our national conference is going to be in April. The theme of the conference is very timely. It's myth, memory, and monuments. That worked out well. We would love to have you down there. It's also during Fiesta Week, which promises to make the city extra lively. So again, we hope to see you. So with that, if you ever have any questions about the Illinois Council or the National Council, feel free to ask me. We also have a couple of other board members. Ted Green is on the national board as well. He's in Missouri here, but you can certainly ask Joan too. And with that, I will turn it over to Joan. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dean. This is the 12th conference I've put together for the Missouri Council for History Education. Love doing it. It's so much fun, and it's so cool when the day comes and here you are, and I can't let the moment go without paying special appreciation and thanks to our treasurer, registrar, who's back here. So Angela Shear has to stand up one more time because I do this from the vantage point of being a retired history educator, but all that registration stuff she does while holding down a full-time teaching job, and I appreciate it so much. So you've had lots of emails from Angela, and I appreciate her work so much. I wanted to suggest for kicking off the morning that you try to imagine, if you can, a time when a foreign government tries to influence one of our elections. I also wanted you to see if you can let your imagination run wild and think about a time when our government was intensely concerned about keeping immigrants out and finding ways to encourage them to self-deport. And then try to imagine a time when the executive was so thin-skinned that criticism upset him, and he tried to find ways to intimidate the press. If you can imagine a time such as that, I think you'll truly enjoy Professor Berkin's latest book. And as you get into the book, you'll have to pinch yourself and come back and look at the cover and discover that you're really reading about the 1890s. I take that back, the 1790s. If I'm 100 years off, it's just, a senior moment, but that's okay. It was a real treat when Professor Berkin agreed to be our speaker, and it has been our custom because we believe that you need to read. And I know you probably, like me, only get to read real books, from in the summertime, but that's okay. So we have traditionally offered to attendees a book authored by one of our featured speakers. And this year when I talked to Professor Berkin and discovered that not only was this hot off the press, May 2017, she made it possible for us to get a price that we could afford. And so thanks to a generous grant, again, from the Missouri Humanities Council, take home your copy of her latest book, which I think you will thoroughly enjoy. Professor Berkin recently retired from Baruch College of the City University of New York. Their loss, our gain, because that made it possible for her to agree to be here with us in St. Louis today for the conference. Professor Berkin received her BA from Barnard College and her MA and PhD from Columbia University. And the book that you received today is her 8th book, I think. Am I right, or did I miss one? My personal favorite, I was, if we hadn't gotten this, I was lobbying for a brilliant solution inventing the American Constitution because I really, really liked that one. That might have been one of the early ones that I read about. We had a workshop for elementary teachers yesterday afternoon. Professor Berkin spoke to them as well, and we gave them a copy of Revolutionary Mothers, which also is a delightful book. And if you're really lucky, you could win one of them as a door prize. Okay? You may have seen her before. She's been a consultant on History Channel and PBS documentaries. And when I was a full-time classroom teacher, she was in my classroom every fall when I showed a documentary on the Shays' Rebellion. That was fun. And then I would say, see, I know her. Anyway, because I first met Professor Berkin as part of a TAH grant team in Blue Springs when we were doing a colloquium there, and was so impressed, not only with her knowledge and her ability to convey that historical knowledge, but her willingness to work with teachers and work well with teachers. And not everybody does that well. And she does it so well. And so it was just a really wonderful opportunity when I learned that she had retired and might be able to come. So overjoyed today to bring you Professor Carol Berkin, who will speak to us on Forging an American Identity, I think is the title we decided on. Professor Berkin?
Wait, I have to turn this on. Now can you hear me? My son says I have the loudest voice in America, so he never thinks I need a microphone, but I tell him I'm not usually shouting at them to bring their dirty clothes for the laundry. I served 10 years on the board of the National MOCHE, and I learned a lot doing those colloquia. We always had a team of a historian, a teacher, and a pedagogy expert, and we were literally a team, all equal to one another. And at the end, I pointed out that I had learned more about teaching from them than they had ever learned about history from me, and it was really true. So I'm very happy to be here today, even though my plane trip was a little... When Joan greeted me, I was really frowning because it had been delayed so much, but she took me for lunch and I cheered up. Even before the rap musical Hamilton took the nation by storm, historians had begun to focus a good deal of scholarly interest on the adoption of the Constitution and on that first decade of the new federal government. I had considered wrapping this entire talk, but not really capable. Their work has made it clear that the politics of the 1790s was as divisive and ideologically driven as those we're experiencing today. And I'm glad Joan introduced it that way because it really was uncanny to me. As I was doing the research, I kept thinking, it's just like CNN. It's the same set of issues, only there were no H-bombs involved. It was, in fact, a decade filled with crises and conflicts, domestic and international, many of which were going to spill over until the next century. You probably know from working with your students that the average American, young and old, has a vision. There was a revolution, and that was a crisis, and then the Constitution was written, and then everything was fine till the Civil War. Right? Or as one of my students once put it, I just loved it. Ever since the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, he was obviously not a sailor, America was the greatest and richest country in the world. Fortunately, he was an accounting major, not a history major. What I'm getting at is most people don't have a sense that the first decade under the Constitution was a nail-biter. That is, it was a period when absolutely the majority of Americans thought this government was never going to last, that something was going to happen, either a tyranny or we would be invaded or we'd go back to the state governments having all the power and there would be a loose confederation like the Articles of Confederation, and that this first decade is filled. I picked 4 crises. I put up 5 fingers. I'm not a mathematician. 4 crises. Good job. But I could have picked 4 other crises. It was really an incredibly tense decade, and the stakes were really very high. Most of the scholarship that's been done has viewed all of these crises and conflicts through a single lens. That is, they've evaluated them solely in terms of the part they played in fostering our first party system. Thus, everything from the uprising in Western Pennsylvania among Western Pennsylvania distillers to the diplomatic failure that has come to be known as the XYZ affair has been given importance by these scholars primarily because they contributed to the emergence of the Jeffersonian Republicans as a challenge to the Federalists who were in power. I decided, I was retired, no one could do anything to me. I wasn't up for promotion again, so everything was, I said, I'm going to take a different point of view. The focus on political party development, and it's important, has obscured, I think, as much as it has illuminated. And that's what drove me to write this book. I think it's muted our appreciation of the enormity of these challenges that the crises pose to the survival of this government. A government that even after ratification had to struggle to establish its legitimacy and its sovereignty both at home and abroad. It was this contingency, this uncertainty, the sheer fragility of this experiment in nation building that I tried to recreate in A Sovereign People. No one understood the stakes involved in the struggle better than George Washington. Always good to have Washington on your side, right? In his first inaugural address, the president spoke frankly of his doubts that he could effectively oversee the new government's survival. He confessed his uncertainty that he was really up to the task of transforming the Constitution's blueprint for a true union of the states into an effective working government. I am, he reminded his audience, unpracticed in the duties of civil administration. But like most of the Federalists, he would choose for his cabinet, and all of them were Federalists except for Jefferson. You may remember that Jefferson opposed the Constitution. He was in France as our ambassador to France, and he wrote a 20-page attack on the Constitution and sent it to everyone he knew, and he said, vote against this, don't support it, it's a terrible idea. Of course, when he became president, he began to refer to the men who wrote the Constitution as demigods. Jefferson was always fond of changing his mind once he was in power. Like the Federalists he had chosen, and like those who served in Congress, Washington was convinced that the effort had to be made. For like Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, John Jay, and the other men who called themselves Federalists, Washington was in fact a nation builder. Like them, he was convinced that an empowered national government was America's surest path to that economic growth and prosperity that my student dated from 1620, that it was the only way to maintain civil law and social order, that it was necessary to protect the country's borders and to gain the vital respect and recognition from foreign nations that would ensure America's continued independence. If you've had a look at A Brilliant Solution, you know that on the eve of the writing of the Constitution, the French ambassador was writing home to his superiors, what part of the United States would you like to take when it falls apart? And so it was very clear that most European countries who paid any attention at all to America, which was really not a very important place in their minds, thought, pretty soon it'll fall apart. Flawed though the Constitution might be, tenuous though the survival of any republic in history had proven to be, these Federalists were certain that the Constitution and its government were the best and the only hope for America's survival. Over the next 8 years and into the Adams administration, these men saw themselves not simply as the midwives of the Constitution, but as its guardian. And they would labor mightily to ensure the new government's survival. In the end, they made the fatal mistake of confusing guardianship with ownership, and they proved unable to recognize when their work was done. If you've read books from this period, you know that most historians who love Jefferson make the Federalists the villains. Oh, they were elitists. Oh, they didn't support democracy. Neither did Jefferson, but that's okay. Oh, they were terrible guys, and they did everything wrong. And thank heavens in 1800 Jefferson was elected, and then life was good. Well, you will see that that is not my argument. I believe the Federalists saved the country. They made a lot of mistakes, but they saved the Constitution. They established national identity. And though in the end they were unable to let go, they still deserve credit. In A Sovereign People, I looked closely at 4 crises. Each one posed a different and unique challenge, either to the authority of the federal government, to American sovereignty and independence from foreign control, or to the legitimacy of the Constitution itself. Yet with the resolution of each of these crises, the country did move slowly toward an affirmation of the Constitution and its government. Thus, the book traces a trajectory of a rising American nationalism, a growing American identity that acted as a centripetal force, creating a real union out of 13 sovereign states until the Civil War threatened to take it apart. The first of these crises was the Whiskey Rebellion, and it challenged, I always like anything related to alcohol, and it challenged the federal government's right to impose an excise tax on distilled alcohol. But in broader terms, the insurgency by these Western Pennsylvania whiskey makers was actually a denial of Congress's authority about anything. Their protest was violent and well organized. It's really interesting when you tell students that they tarred and feathered people, the kids think that's funny. But in fact, pouring hot tar all over someone's body, the feathers were just for humiliation. When you tried to get the tar off, you removed several layers of skin. And this is a world without antibiotics or anything that could protect the exposed skin, the new exposed skin, and you could die from tarring and feathering. So when these men armed themselves and threatened anybody who tried to collect the revenue from the distilleries, when they tarred and feathered them, when they strung them up and threatened to hang them, when they burned their homes down, this was serious business. This was a real rebellion. It wasn't romantic. You can read some books about the Whiskey Rebellion that paints it as sort of this romantic uprising of oppressed farmers. That is not what was happening. This was a group of men who were making money off selling whiskey, and they didn't want to pay a tax for it. By 1794, they'd formed an insurgent army of several thousand men, and their leaders were actually threatening to create a new independent nation on the frontier. They were going to call it Spotsylvania, I believe. And they were going to simply withdraw from American society. They likened their resistance to the American resistance to British taxation, but that analogy just doesn't hold water. Despite all the liberty poles they put up, and despite all their rhetoric of tyranny, they were doing battle against a law that had been imposed by duly elected representatives, not by a government that had denied them a voice. President Washington saw it for what it was: a full-blown assault on federal authority, on civil order, and on the Union. Despite thinking that he might not be good at this job, Washington revealed an astounding acuity about how to run a government. He understood that if he acted precipitously, he would give credence to the lingering and very widespread fears among people who would oppose the Constitution that the federal government was going to be a vehicle for tyranny. Hamilton, who was an extraordinarily brilliant man but had no political intelligence at all, fortunately, he never ran for office. He always got appointed to office because Hamilton just didn't understand people. He understood economics, and he understood power, but he really didn't understand people. Hamilton said, we've got to go in right away. We've got to crush this rebellion. We've got to show them that they can't rise up. And Washington, who really respected and loved Hamilton like a son, said, well, I think that's really not a great idea, because then people will say, see, in the first 5 years of the government, it became tyrannical and it marched with an army against citizens. So Washington moved methodically. He took every possible peaceful step toward resolving the crisis. He tried persuasion. He tried legal and judicial procedures. He sent a commission to negotiate with the rebels. He offered them compromise. He built a paper trail, in essence, of trying to do everything he could, and when nothing worked, he called out militia units in force from Pennsylvania and from neighboring states to put down this rebellion. He led an army of 13,000 men, thousands more than he had ever led in the American Revolution. In the face of this huge army, the rebellion simply collapsed. Everybody put down their weapons, said, I wasn't involved in this, don't look at me. No shots were fired. There were strict instructions that there would be no shots fired unless you were fired upon. Few men were arrested. And in the end, Washington was smart enough to issue a blanket amnesty to everyone involved. The first major domestic crisis was over, and the challenge to the authority of Congress was done. In his deft handling of the Whiskey Rebellion, the president achieved more than the restoration of law and order. He diminished those lingering fears that a federal government was a blueprint for a new tyranny. And at the same time, he sent a clear message that the government was going to fulfill its obligations to protect its officials, and it would enforce the laws passed by the people's elected representatives. The general public's response was overwhelmingly positive. Washington received memorials from churches, from local governments, from state legislatures, all praising what he did. But this praise was aimed directly at Washington the man. They were not praising the government or the executive branch. They were praising their national hero, George Washington. The approval then was based on one leader's charisma, rather than on any respect for the office he held or for the government of which he was a part. It would remain Washington's task to see if his charisma could be transferred to the executive office itself, that is, whether it could be institutionalized instead of being aimed directly at one person. The second crisis, the Genet Affair of 1793, historians rarely have a chance for belly laughs as they do research. You don't really expect to come across someone like Edmund Genet. He was a gift from heaven for me. He was a 26-year-old, bombastic, preoccupied, egotistical, overconfident, and completely unsuccessful diplomat who was a zealous supporter of the French Revolution, even though before the French Revolution, his entire family was involved working for the king. So he was a convert, he was a zealot, and his letters to Jefferson, you can read them online, and they really are hilarious. They're just hot air balloons endlessly, and we have 92 of them, and I just loved reading them. This was a concerted, blatant effort by the French to bend the federal government of the United States to the will of a foreign power. It began when citizen Edmond Charles Genet arrived with instructions from the revolutionary French government to enlist or prod America into active support for the French campaign it was waging to spread its empire of liberty throughout Europe. They talked a lot about spreading liberty and liberating people, but they went into countries with weapons and an army and basically said you're going to be liberated whether you want to be or not. In other words, it was imperialism. The response to it was a huge European war, as I'm sure you know, led by England and her allies against France. And this war was already going on or beginning when Genet arrived in America. The French imperialism had sparked this war, and Federalists immediately recognized the dangers of providing Genet with the support that he was going to demand, because in effect, it would mean a declaration of war against England. Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality, which if you read it and you assign it to your students, you'll see never mentions the word neutrality. Jefferson, who was an ardent supporter of the French, did not want that word in the proclamation. Soon as it was issued, everybody called it the Proclamation of Neutrality, no matter what Jefferson wanted. The Federalists, by this time, 1793, had seen that the French Revolution had taken a rather drastic turn, that people were being guillotined, that people were being arrested without trials, that printing presses were being closed down. And as Hamilton said, our revolutions have gone in divergent paths. And so they were no fans of the French Revolution. Jefferson and Madison still supported the French Revolution. The demands that Genet was going to make were a flagrant disregard of the policy of neutrality, and they constituted a broad attack on American sovereignty. If the U.S. complied, in effect, they would become a satellite or a colony of France. Once again, Washington and his cabinet moved quite cautiously. The French cause was still popular among Americans who still remembered that the French had come to their aid in the Revolution. And several governors of states exercising state sovereignty took on the task of deciding diplomacy, which was really quite dangerous. In particular, in South Carolina, where Genet landed, the governor of South Carolina, Moultrie, just went right ahead and said, sure, you can outfit privateers in the Charleston port to go out and attack British ships. This is really bad for American foreign policy. And in addition, he agreed to help support a French army made up of American citizens who would attack Spanish-held Florida. Also not a very good idea, since the Americans were not at war with France, with Spain. The attempt was to defy federal authority and American neutrality, but slowly and as firmly as possible, in the face of really one of Europe's great powers, the executive branch rejected Genet's agenda piece by piece. He asked that the French debt, the debt America owed France, be paid immediately in one lump sum instead of annual payments. Hamilton said no. Not only would he not do it, but he couldn't do it. The American government didn't have the money. They rejected his interpretation that the treaties of 1778 that had been signed after Saratoga gave France the right, exclusive right, to use the ports of America to arm privateers, to bring in prize ships, and ready for this, to set up French vice admiralty courts in those ports to deal with the sale of the goods and the re-outfitting of the ships as privateers. A foreign court on American soil handling sales of ships and outfitting of ships to fight a country we were at peace with. The president said no. He also mounted secretly, though Jefferson knew about it, a campaign in Kentucky and Western Pennsylvania, where all those whiskey rebels had been, to raise an army of Americans to attack Spanish Louisiana. Right? American citizens going to join a French army, attack Spanish Louisiana. When he was turned down, Genet did not handle it well. He showered the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, with, we only have 92 of his letters. I want you to realize he began in May and his recall came in September. So he sent at least 92 letters to Jefferson and the president, each one more rhetorical than the next. He began to insist that the president was thwarting the wishes of the American people, who he was certain supported France. He said the only legitimate voice of those people was the Congress. The president's policies, he said, were simply mere opinions of a single man. Jefferson tried his best to school Genet on the protocols of diplomacy and to educate him on the division of powers and authority in the U.S. government, but Genet was deaf to the whole thing. The French minister grew more and more strident and demanding, and the whole crisis came to a head when it was reported by Pennsylvania officials that Genet had said he had had enough and he was going to go over the head of the president and appeal directly to the American people. By October, Washington decided it was time to demand Genet's recall. In the meantime, unbeknownst to Genet had made two terrible errors. A, he didn't understand the American government and didn't bother to learn anything about it. And B, it didn't occur to him that the regimes in France itself were turning over rather quickly. So the men who had sent him at the very moment that he was making these demands were on the way to the guillotine, and the Jacobins had taken over. And the Jacobins were not interested in making America a satellite of France. They didn't want to be bothered with that. They just wanted better trade agreement with America because their population and their army was starving. They just wanted all that wheat and all that rice to flow to France, and everything else didn't matter. Genet didn't know this, and he's sending his reports home, and the government is going, what is this madman doing? They agreed to recall Genet, and in fact decided that he too was a traitor. And word came to the president that when the new minister arrived, they were going to arrest Genet, this 26-year-old idiot, and bring him home to France. Washington did an amazing thing. He granted asylum to Edmond Genet. And he said to his cabinet, I'm paraphrasing, he said, when he was their minister, he was a danger and had to be dealt with. Now he is just a young man, and I will not see him killed. Genet went to live in upstate New York. He married the governor of New York's daughter, and he became an American citizen. End of that French crisis. The Genet affair exposed the weakness of the U.S. on the world stage and the danger that powerful nations would come into America and try to subordinate its interests to their own. But it did some positive things. It highlighted the fact that our country had to speak with one voice in foreign affairs. I say that thinking about today's situation where apparently we speak with 5 or 6 voices that contradict one another, but the idea was that the federal government controlled foreign policy. And by the year's end, Americans had decided the federal government ought to control foreign policy. Genet's threat to appeal directly to the people over the head of the president prompted a widespread expression of support, this time not just for Washington, but for the executive branch itself. Or put another way, the Genet Affair accomplished what the Whiskey Rebellion had not. It transferred Washington's charisma to the executive branch of the government. The crises with France were not over, however. I know you know the War of 1812 is coming and that Britain is the big enemy. But in the 1790s, France is the big enemy. This time, the French decided to get tough again, and they were capturing American ships carrying supplies to Britain. And they were doing something that the British were not doing. They were not only taking the ships and the cargo, they were imprisoning the crew in French prisons. And this was something that Americans could hardly allow to go by. By this time, unfortunately, Washington was no longer president, and John Adams was. Now, I'm very fond of John Adams. He was a little bipolar. There's no question about it. If you don't believe me, read his diary. One page would begin, "I will be remembered in history forever for the role I played in the Revolution." And the next page would say, "I am just a lowly worm. I will be dust. No one will remember me. They'll only remember Franklin." And my favorite page was one that said, "So-and-so said hello to me. I wonder what he meant by that." Adams had been trying all his life to be recognized as a great American patriot. And basically people referred to him as his rotundity, because he was short and fat. And he just didn't get, he was like Rodney Dangerfield. He just didn't get any respect. He was a terrible politician. When he got into office, he kept the cabinet that Washington had, and they were all loyal to Alexander Hamilton. They were not loyal to John Adams. He didn't even have the sense to put his own men in office. But he decided to do what Washington had done. When Britain started taking sailors off American ships, Washington sent John Jay to England, and they signed a new peace treaty. Americans didn't get a whole lot out of it, but it calmed the waters, so to speak, between England and... So Adams said, "I'll do that with France." He sends 3 men to sign a new treaty with the French. He sends 3 men who have never had diplomatic experience in their life. He sends John Marshall, going to grow up to be really a very famous Supreme Court justice, but had never been out of Virginia and didn't know anything about diplomacy. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney from South Carolina, who is, not really Harvard material, but a nice guy. And he sent Elbridge Gerry. I don't want you to think that this is a political statement, but Elbridge Gerry was the Ted Cruz of the 1790s. Nobody liked him except John Adams. I mean, seriously, John Adams was his only friend. Everybody in Congress hated him because he would not agree to anything, as Henry Knox said to Adams. He doesn't agree to anything that he didn't propose himself. He will talk you to death. He's not a team player. Don't send him. It's a bad idea. And Adams said, "Oh no, I spoke to him and he promised that he would cooperate." I don't even have to tell you the rest of the story. These 3 babes in the woods go to Paris up against Talleyrand, the sneakiest, slyest, most experienced diplomat in Europe. And Talleyrand refused to formally meet with them. They were there almost a year and a half. Never agreed to formally meet with them until they agreed to some preconditions. The preconditions were a forced loan from the American government to the French, which would immediately put it at war with England, and a bribe for Talleyrand, a rather large bribe for Talleyrand, as a reward for the difficulty of negotiating the treaty. Well, Talleyrand demanded this from every diplomat who came to, that was just the price of doing business. It was sort of like the construction trades in New York. You know, you had to pay something to the inspector. Anybody else might have known this if they had any diplomatic experience. These men knew nothing. They were enraged. They were upset. They said, this is an insult. And it was. It was. Elbridge Gerry started fighting with his two colleagues and decided to meet secretly with Talleyrand, which destroyed the entire mission, and finally everybody came home. Talleyrand had sent 3 unofficial men to speak to these 3 Americans to lay out his demands. And Adams called them X, Y, and Z, which is why it was called the XYZ affair. Why did Adams call them X, Y, and Z? Because the Americans were still in France when John Marshall's dispatches came to him, and he wanted to reveal what the French were doing, but he didn't want to endanger the Americans till they left France, so he didn't name names. So the XYZ affair is what this event is called. No treaty, no nothing. The Americans came home. Strangely enough, Americans were enraged, not that the men had failed, but that France had demanded a bribe. They read this as an insult to American sovereignty, which it was, but this is a pretty unsophisticated view of what was happening. They turned John Marshall and Charles Pinckney into heroes. They threw rocks at Elbridge Gerry. He couldn't understand why. He, dense as ever. And Adams, for a brief moment, became a hero. Everything Adams had ever dreamed of for about a month or a month and a half came true. He was showered with thanks from people for standing up to American honor. And Adams went whole hog. Adams raised an army. He created a navy. Of course, he had to tax people to do this. And he got ready for a war, an invasion from France. Well, no invasion came. The French were not about to send their navy, that's the only way they could get people to America, to attack a 2-bit country when they were at war with England. So as the months went by, and the American people were still paying these taxes to support an army that wasn't doing anything, and a navy that wasn't doing anything, you can imagine that popular opinion shifted. People had been extremely disturbed by what had happened, and you know the slogan of the XYZ affair, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute, eventually became, why in heck am I paying taxes for this army? Nothing's happening. And Adams's popularity sank. It was, however, an important moment for America because this was the turning point in the creation of an American identity. Americans in every single state who had once thought of themselves as Virginians or Marylanders or Connecticut men, first and foremost, now began to talk of themselves as Americans. The beginning of nationalism really came out of this terrible failure of diplomacy. In Virginia, the heart of Jefferson country, one of Jefferson's followers said, "On this day, we are all Americans." And so this was a commitment to supporting the government no matter what happened, no matter how critical you might be of it, that wasn't destroyed until the Civil War. The fourth crisis and last crisis was the fault of the Federalists themselves. Up until now, the Federalists had been really batting 1,000. That is, they've been doing the right things and they've been winning support from the populace. But suddenly they looked around and they said, you know, we're controlling Congress, we're controlling the presidency. Right now, people are very supportive of the federal government. But look at Jefferson's party. We've got to do something to put the brakes on Jefferson's party. Jefferson's party used to be just in the South, but it's creeping north. It's taking over in Pennsylvania. It's even in Vermont. It's in New Hampshire. There are Jeffersonians in Boston. They're appealing to immigrant populations. They're appealing to the Irish and the Germans. The Irish who hate Great Britain and therefore support anybody who hates Great Britain. And the Germans who are farmers who really don't trust merchants and banks. And so the Federalists hatch a terrible idea. They say, we're going to put the brakes on the Jeffersonian Party. We're going to extend naturalization from 5 years to 14 years. So all these Irish and German immigrants can't vote. We're going to try to force the French immigrants in America who had come up from the Caribbean into self-deportation because there'll be a problem. And we are going to pass 2 acts called the Alien Acts. The Alien Friends Act that said if you cause any trouble for the American government, if the president thinks you're dangerous to the security of America, even if your country isn't at war with America, he can deport you. No trial, no nothing. The president can deport you. And the Alien Enemies Act that said if you are dangerous to the country and we're at war with your country, the president can deport you. The Alien Friends Act was only for 2 years. The Alien Enemies Act, by the way, is still on the books. And the first time it was ever used was in the 1920s. Adams never deported anybody. Historians love to write about the Alien and Sedition Acts. They get all carried away. See how terrible the Federalists were. They were oppressive. They did terrible things, except they never did anything. They passed these 2 laws, and the president said, I'm never deporting anybody, forget that. Then they passed the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act was designed to suppress the Republican press. They had called Adams every name in the book, a querulous, toothless, senile old man. They had called Hamilton. There were no restraints. If you think today there's something called fake news, you should read 18th century newspapers. They could publish anything they wanted. There was no restraint on them. And they did. They published fake information about the government conspiring to do things. They published fake information about Hamilton embezzling money from the Treasury. They published anything they wanted. And these Republican newspapers were very powerful. And so they passed a Sedition Act that said if you printed, published, and even uttered an attack on the federal government, you could be put in prison. That's pretty serious, right? If you take a look at what really happened, it's almost laughable. Only 17 people were ever arrested. Only 11 were ever indicted. Only 4 were ever sent to prison. And the men who were sent to prison were entitled to go ahead and continue to publish their newspaper from prison. So, it's not really a very the Federalists meant to be oppressive, but most of them were lawyers, and they really believed in the rule of law. And so they would arrest these infamous people like Franklin Bach, and they would let him go off on bail. And he would go right back to his newspaper and he would keep publishing attacks on the Federalists. The 4 men that were put in jail published pamphlets and books about how unfair their trial had been while they were in prison. So, though the Federalists may have meant to be oppressive, they had a very bad record as oppressive figures. Despite all the draconian tone of the act, they were really not able to suppress the Republican press. And the Sedition Act helped contribute to Jefferson's election in 1800. The success or the failure of these laws was less important than the crisis that they produced, because what happened is Virginia and Kentucky published resolutions written secretly by Jefferson and Madison that introduced into the vocabulary of American political history the term nullification. The Kentucky resolutions written by Jefferson said, if a state disapproved of a law passed by the federal government, they could nullify it. And if necessary, blood could be shed. That's in the Kentucky resolutions. I don't think that Jefferson intended for secession and nullification to take place, but he is responsible for introducing these ideas into American political history. It's important to think about this because states' rights has been one of the great engines of American history throughout our lifetime. Federalism, which is the single real innovation in the Constitution, Hamilton recognized right away that it was unworkable. He said, you cannot divide sovereignty. You cannot have some powers belong to one government, some powers belong to other governments, and some powers shared by the two governments. He got up in the Constitutional Convention in one of his rare speeches, and he said, this will never work. It'll cause problems for the rest of time. The only solution is to abolish the states. And everybody said, sit down, Alex, take your medicine. That's not going to happen. Nevertheless, Hamilton was right. That is, federalism has been one of the great engines of American history. From the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, to the Hartford Convention, to the nullification controversy, to that pesky event known as the Civil War, to Orville Thorpus standing in the schoolhouse door saying, I don't care what the federal judiciary says, we're not integrating, to states that say, we don't care that gay marriage is legal, we're not allowing it, or states that don't allow abortion, or states that don't allow whatever. Federalism is unresolvable. The Civil War did not resolve it. And it is Jefferson who introduces in the Kentucky resolutions this idea of state nullification. Let's think about, in closing, let me say, let's think about the tragedy of this ending of this decade. The tragedy of the Jeffersonians was that they didn't realize the destructive potential of the remedies they were proposing for the Sedition Act if they were ever uncoupled from a real loyalty to the Union, which is exactly what happened in the Civil War. But the tragedy of the Federalists was that they didn't recognize that their mission to guard the Constitution and the government had already been accomplished. Their guardianship of the Constitution had made them feel proprietary toward it. It led them to conflate the fate of the government with their own fate as its leaders, and to see all opposition to their policies as an attack on the Constitution itself. Their dogged devotion to protect the government blinded them to a new hunger among common citizens for a stronger voice in politics and for a more democratic social order. One analogy I could give you is helicopter parents. They just couldn't let go. The Jeffersonians, on the other hand, recognized this hunger for more participation by the general populace, and that is what carried them into the White House. Thank you. Did I do it? Did I stay in my time limit? She was supposed to go like this if I went over. So if you have any questions, I will say what I always say. Please don't ask me anything I don't know the answer to. And if you do, I will do what all of you as teachers know. I'll say, see me after class. Right? And then I'll run. Right? Anybody have any questions or comments? I know probably a lot of you teach, yay, Jeffersonians, boo, Federalists. And I hope this will overcome that in you. I think the Federalists did a darn good job of saving the Constitution. But I'm open to any. Do you teach this period? And do you teach these events? Please go online and get some of Genet's letters. Your students will love them. They are just filled with, we shed our blood in the name of your liberty. Now you must be men. Stand up, shed your blood for they're just wonderful. I mean, they are. And by all means, read John Marshall's papers. I mean, you don't have to read all of them, but his dispatches, his account of what is going on in France when they're the commissioners, and the exchanges with Elbridge Gerry are truly hilarious. And your students will enjoy them as well. This is a great chance to use primary source documents that kids will like, or that they'll find amusing and still teach history. Right? Or you can read some of the Whiskey Rebellions. Hamilton publishes, it's in the First Federal Congress, they're all online and also have been published, appendix. And it's Hamilton's list of all the atrocities committed by the Whiskey Rebels. And that's a lot of fun too, because they strip guys naked and they tie them up to trees and they tar and feather them, and it's sort of the safest violence your students will ever get to see. So these are good primary sources that are pretty much available to you, both online and in published. Yeah.
Can you find any of the fake news?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Fortunately, there was no one, the federal government did not have, until a decade later, did not have an official who wrote down what happened in Congress. The only people who wrote it down were the newspapers. And I can never remember her name. She has 3 names. Charlotte somebody, it'll come to me, has published a paperback book called The First Federal Congress. And it has the Federalist newspaper reporting on what happened in Congress and the Republican newspapers reporting. And you will see what they say about the president, what they say about Congress, the stories they tell about a conspiracy, about a plan, a plot. Jefferson encouraged this greatly. The editor of one of the most famous Republican rag sheets, Jefferson gave him a job working in the State Department so that he would have enough money to edit this newspaper. And Jefferson liked to call the Federalists monocrats, that is, monarch supporters. And he also referred to them as Anglomancy, guilty of Anglomancy, that is, the love of England. I thought at first it was a sexual act, but it turned out to be, just the love of England. And these things are all written down in the Aurora newspaper, which is the newspaper that Ben Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bakke, published, and later William Duane published. Bakke died in the yellow fever epidemic. And so you can read a lot of this material. There's also a book that's about this thick. It's good for putting your stereo speakers on if you decide you don't want to read the whole book, called The Aurora. And it's almost all the pages of the publication of The Aurora day by day. And you will see the attack, poor John Adams. I mean, the attacks on him were really just vicious. One of the men arrested for uttering an attack on the government was a Newark, New Jersey garbage scow operator. His name was Luther Baldwin, and he was in a bar, a tavern, in the middle of the day. And if you ran a Newark garbage scow, you probably would be drinking heavily too, with two of his friends. And they were pretty drunk. And John Adams came through Newark on his way to Quincy, Massachusetts, which is where Abigail, where their home was. He was going on a vacation. It was sort of his Mar-a-Lago, right? He was going on vacation. And he goes through Newark, and the city fathers of Newark fire off cannons in his honor. And one of Luther Baldwin's friends, who is drunk, says, "Oh, look, they're firing a cannon at John Adams' arse." And Luther Baldwin, not to be outdone with this incredible witticism, says, "I wouldn't mind if they fired a cannon through his arse." And someone overheard this, and they were arrested for sedition, right? I mean, that's how pathetic this whole thing was. And of course, they pleaded not guilty. And the judge, who must have found this ridiculous, the judge charged them a fine. And they said, well, now we're going to plead not guilty. They had pleaded guilty, and now they said, we're going to plead not guilty. So he put them in jail for a week, and he fined them. And all of this is written up in the Aurora as this enormous challenge to the American voters' freedom of speech, which in a way it was. I mean, I have to say, of course, if they had arrested, as the French did, 50,000 of these people and put them in prison, if they had destroyed the printing presses, if they had executed the Bakke and other editors, it would have been real oppression. But they don't do any of that. They put them out on bail. They let them edit their newspapers. I mean, it's a sort of mild oppression of people, and it has no impact at all. I'm sure that Luther Baldwin continued to insult the president when he was drunk, but you can read all of this in the Aurora, in this book about the Aurora, and you can definitely read it in this book on the First Federal Congress. Yeah.
I'm curious, when you talk about these oppressions against the press weren't really that oppressive, when we see today, to compare the 1790s and what we have today, we see President Trump tweet out himself body slamming a CNN cartoon,
yes,
or hitting it with a train.
Yes.
That in itself is cute and little, but we fear that that's crossing a line that can lead to something more. Common people have that same fear?
Well, first of all, let me say, it is frightening because it is not a law and order step by the president. Adams never did anything like that. I mean, take a look at Adams. He does not deport anyone, right? If you put that power in the hands of 20th century presidents, they not only deported aliens, they deported American citizens who were born abroad. It's the extent of the use, and it's the respect for law and order, respect for the rule of law, that when you look at these cases that the Federalists operated, there is a tremendous respect for the processes of the law. They don't just jail these men. And you have to compare it to what's happening in France, where literally they swoop down, take these men, execute them, and burn down the building in which the presses were. And remember, on the eve of the Civil War, that's what happened to abolitionist presses. In Ohio, Lovejoy is killed and his press is destroyed. In South Carolina, if you sent abolitionist literature down there, they made bonfires out of it. I mean, this is when you step to the point of violence as opposed to actual legal processes. I don't support the sedition law, but I think that you can see that the Federalists never overstep what the legal process is. And so I think today I would be more concerned just because there does not seem to be a respect for the law in the same form, and by anybody. I'm not, making a screed again. But there does not seem to be a respect for the law, a respect for the judiciary, a respect for the process that the Federalists had toward the law. And that's why I think it's more frightening today, and certainly was more frightening in the 1920s and 1930s. Yeah. Was there a question back? Yeah.
I didn't have a question, but I will ask a question. I'm wondering how one ties this story to westward expansion. And the question I wrote was, what is the relationship of the West to federalism? And I'm wondering when those questions start getting asked.
Well, the Whiskey Rebellion is in part not just about the excise tax. These are, first of all, Western Pennsylvania, and Western Virginia, which is what Kentucky became, from Bacon's rebellion in the 17th century to the Paxton Boys, has always had a kind of vigilante tradition, right? These Western farmers in Pennsylvania were furious with the government for not having managed to sign a treaty for navigation of the Mississippi River. One of the reasons that they turned their grain, their rye and wheat, into alcohol was to carry their crop 300 miles across mountains to Philadelphia to sell it. Was extremely expensive for them in terms of travel time with a wagon, but also by the time they got there, often the crop was spoiled. And so they began to turn these grains into alcohol and put it in barrels and take it because, the older the alcohol is, the better as far as they were concerned. But it was still extremely expensive for them to do this. They would be away from home for 2 or 3 months. This traveling, I complained about my airplane trip, but, travel then was really difficult. And so they wanted the Mississippi River opened for navigation and the port of New Orleans so that they could bring their crops down the river and then onto the ocean for them to be sold. They didn't really understand how difficult a negotiation with a powerful European country would be for this little pipsqueak country, America. And I really promise you, the hardest thing in the world to do with college students is to persuade them that America was not the most important country in the world. I mean, they really believed that in Paris, everybody opened the newspaper to the American news first. It's just so hard to get them to understand that we were really not important. So they were furious that negotiations with Spain had broken down. Only a few years later, they're going to sign the Gardoqui Treaty, and they're going to get this transportation on the Mississippi River. But that's the primary thing that is making them hostile to the federal government. That and the fact that so far Mad Anthony Wayne has not been able to kill off all the Indians. And so they are very upset about Indian raids on this expansion that they've engaged in onto Indian lands. You know, Americans were land grabbers, and they would take the land and then they would demand to be protected from this outrageous attack by Indians. They have no idea why their innocent communities are being attacked. And of course, eventually, Mad Anthony Wayne does defeat the Indians, and the Treaty of Fallen Timbers is signed. So a lot of their complaints are alleviated in the next decade. But the Whiskey Rebellion is a kind of sign of the frustration of these Westerners. Most textbooks will tell you there's already a North-South division between agriculture, plantations, and northern commerce and trade. What they don't tell you is there's equally an East-West division. And you can see this East-West division in the debates in Congress, which again you can read. You can see this very clearly from the very beginning of the federal government, that Western delegates to Congress insist that they are being ignored, that their demands are being ignored, that the interests of their people are being ignored. And these people are going to be swept up into the Jeffersonian Party. So it's very early on that this concern about Western interests develops. And it's not so much about Western expansion as it is about solidifying economic opportunity for Pennsylvania and for what becomes Kentucky, which was Western Virginia. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. One of the things I hope you saw, because we're all teachers of history, is the power of the narrative and how engrossing these stories are when they are well told. I have often said to my student teachers, one of the mistakes teacher education makes is we don't require all teacher pre-service people to go take an acting class. Because they're wonderful stories, and the story engages people, and Carol tells them so well, and I enjoyed it so much. You will enjoy the book. It is really powerful and really interesting. There will be lunch in the River Room from 12 to 1. Please visit our exhibitors. They have gone to a lot of work to set things up. We have door prizes. Some of you will be lucky winners. We will draw for half of them today and half of them tomorrow. You must be present to win. And I believe this year we're doing it with random numbers. So you are numbered on Angela's wonderful registration sheets, and they'll draw numbers, and some of you will win. And we are indebted to a whole host of people. I've listed that on that changes and additions to the program sheet that you receive. So please enjoy that. Also, if you would like to enter the raffle for a classroom set of America, the Story of Us, and the DVD that goes with it,